Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Most presidents in the early part of the United States didn't have middle names, right? It was just Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. You had a couple like John Quincy Adams, of course, but not every single one had a middle name. Most people think George Washington didn't have a middle name because you won't find it on the Wikipedia page or whatever nonsense they come up with. But I do know his middle name. George Washington would often sign his personal letters George A. Washington. Most people think, oh, all of his personal letters must be destroyed by now, but they're just not looking hard enough. I look so hard, I know everything, right? He would always sign it George A. Washington. Now, most people would say, oh, what does his A stand for? Is it Augustine, like his father's name? No. George Washington's middle name was April Fools. I got you, I think, probably. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When President James Polk was running for president in 1844, he didn't win his birth state of North Carolina, nor his residence state of Tennessee. James Polk is the only president in American history to not win either his home state or his birth state. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, I'm about to accompany my father voting early for a by-election that's happening in the seat of University Rosedale here in Canada. I obviously cannot vote. I'm under the age of 18, so my father will be voting, and I'm going to accompany him. In unrelated news, President William McKinley owned a bicycle. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Today is Easter Monday, and yesterday was Easter proper. It was just Easter. And usually the United States president would wish a happy Easter message because all of the United States presidents have been Christians as far as we know. We're not sure about Abraham Lincoln, but likely he was also Christian. But yesterday, President Donald Trump put out a truth on Truth Social, giving all praise to Allah, the Islamic God, becoming the very first president to give all praise to Allah on Easter Sunday. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, here in Toronto, it snowed, and unfortunately it did snow and it's very cold out here. Hopefully that's not what Ulysses S. Grant said on his final day, because it was July 23rd. Speaking of Ulysses Grant's final day, he was probably very happy that it was, because no one was more willing to go up to heaven than Ulysses S. Grant was. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The United States does not have an official language recognized by the government, and no, President Trump didn't change that. He doesn't have the authority to do so. But yes, English is not the official language of the United States, and it definitely wasn't in 1880. President James Garfield decided to make a campaign speech in the German language because he was campaigning with a large German audience, which was actually common in the late 19th century. It's the only campaign speech not to be delivered in English. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. President Herbert Hoover was the very first president to reach 80 years old since John Quincy Adams. And that's not the fact today, I've already told you that. But when Herbert Hoover did eventually die in 1964, we don't actually know what his last words were, because they were not recorded. What was recorded was his final note, a get better soon message to President Harry Truman after he had hit himself on a bathtub. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 13th President of the United States, Millard Fillmore, was the very first president to have his father live through his presidency. Historically, that was quite rare since lifespans were shorter, especially amongst men, so I think that's interesting. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. President Woodrow Wilson is not exactly known as the most patriotic president, probably because a lot of people think that he was the worst president, and rightly so. But Woodrow Wilson is, to date, the only president to be buried in Washington, D.C. Although John Quincy Adams was temporarily interned there, he's now interred in Massachusetts, so Woodrow Wilson is the only president to be buried in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. President Lyndon Johnson was very well known as the president that was just like, I'm gonna do this just because I can do this. And that's probably what was going through his mind. Actually, that is what was going through his mind when he decided to urinate on a Secret Service member. He said he did it just because he could. He was the president. Who cares? Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. On this day, 8 score ago, Abraham Lincoln was murked. He was watching a play, and he got shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, 1865. However, many people will look at this and say, okay, he died April 14th, but no, he didn't die on April 14th. It's not a James Garfield situation where he lived for 1,000 days. He lived until the next day. Abraham Lincoln was alive, technically. He was in a coma from 10 o'clock at night when he got shot to 7 o'clock in the morning when he passed away. The doctors were trying to meddle with him, and they were using unsterilized fingers going in his brain. So obviously not the best idea, but before the conspiracy theorists get into my comments, there was absolutely no chance that Abraham Lincoln would have survived that shot, whether or not the doctors were doing what they were doing in his brain. If I hit myself right now, it didn't hurt because I didn't hit myself too hard, or else maybe I would drop the phone. But I hit myself, right? My arm's still gonna hurt regardless if someone else takes my hand away from me, right? That's not how it works. Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. One of the biggest presidential hobbies of the day is to go golfing. In fact, the current president of the United States likes to golf quite a bit, probably more than the average human does. However, golfing in the presidency was not such common practice during George Washington or John Adams' administration. It really started to take off with William Howard Taft, the very first president to play golf while serving as president. Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The presidential veto is one of the most controversial powers that the President of the United States has, but he does have it. But for most of the early American history, a president actually vetoing a bill was pretty rare. In fact, there were some who were just like, you know what? If this bill's gonna pass, then it's gonna pass. George Washington was like that, of course, because of course he was. But one president who was definitely not like that, Grover Cleveland. He has more vetoes than any of his predecessors combined. He vetoed the most bills in American history that a president would. And a lot of those vetoes were still overridden, but still it brought to the forefront that the president does have this power. Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. For the first 100 years-ish of American history, it wasn't very easy to transport yourself across the nation. And America was such a huge nation, it was pretty much impossible to get from DC to the West Coast. But Rutherford Hayes did it. He was the very first United States president to visit the West Coast while in office. Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The position of Speaker of the House of Representatives in the United States is one of the most important positions that a politician can have, because it's like 4th place in direct line to become president when the president dies. Yeah, it's a pretty important place in the House of Representatives. So you'd think that most of the United States presidents had also served as Speakers of the House. No, in fact, only one did, James Polk. But in the election of 1844, he did run against Henry Clay, a former Speaker of the House, meaning that election was between two Speakers of the House. Hello, I'm Dazad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan survived a very close assassination attempt. He made a full recovery eventually, And the very first thing he said to his doctors, in his, very quick wit, and, Ronald Reagan was always known for being a humorous guy. So the very first thing after he was shot, made a recovery after he was shot, was, please tell me you're all Republicans. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, President Lyndon Johnson, he was president in 1968. And you know who else was around in 1968? Well, his doctors were around. And you know what they said? They said, you know what, Lyndon Johnson, you have only 4 years left to live because you were such a heavy smoker, you are not going to make it much longer. You're going to die in 4 years. Lyndon Johnson was like, okay, sure, I'm still going to smoke. And he died in 1973. However, 22 days in to 1973, so it was pretty much 4 years. So, I think that is maybe not a coincidence because they are doctors, but very interesting. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. One of the oldest presidents in American history is James Buchanan. And in fact, he was so old when he became president that he decided to choose a young vice president. In fact, he chose the youngest vice president in American history. His age gap with his vice president was 29 years. The oldest in American history until right now. Donald Trump is the oldest president, and J.D. Vance is one of the youngest vice presidents to ever be inaugurated. Their age gap is 38 years. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day, which I'll tell you in a moment while I fix my hair. Not much better, but I can't really do much without a comb. Anyways, William Howard Taft was the heaviest United States president ever. He weighed something over 300 pounds. And this was mostly due to stress eating. It was not water weight this time. It was stress eating because he felt like he was going to grow up to be a failure. Well, he became president, so I don't know if he would exactly consider that a failure. But anyways, Taft then, promptly in his post-presidency, which actually was pretty long for someone who was at one point over 300 pounds, he lost over 150 pounds in his post-presidency, which is incredible to hear. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, yesterday President Trump was thankfully unharmed at a dinner event yesterday in the nation's capital. So I'm going to talk about something positive for him and not negative. When he was first elected in 2016, he was the first Republican in nearly 100 years, since 1928, to not be elected with either Richard Nixon or one of the Bushes on the ticket. That's incredible. And since Trump is, very prominent, he won 2 elections, right? The next Republican to win would be the first Republican in over 100 years, at least over 100 years, to win without Richard Nixon, one of the Bushes, or Donald Trump on the ticket. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Ronald Reagan, before he became a politician, was a lifeguard. And as a lifeguard, he saved about 80 lives. That's incredible. I think I've saved maybe 0 lives. Actually, no, I think it's actually 1. That's a different story for a different video. But that's only 1/80th of what Ronald Reagan did. 80 lives is crazy. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, today is James Monroe's birthday. He would have been 200 and something years old. He's way too old. He's unk status, some people would say. James Monroe was once painted, because back then they didn't have photographs. He's so unk, he didn't even have a photo taken of him. I have lots of photos taken of me, right? Nobody's painted me, except for me when I was in grade 2, right? But who cares? Someone painted James Monroe when he was president, and that was his official portrait as president. The guy who painted him was Samuel Morse. And now those people with a keen ear and not so keen eyes, they might be blind, could tell me that that's the guy who created Morse code. I don't think you need to be blind. I was thinking of Braille. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. One of the most major issues that you might hear about in the United States is the issue of national debt, because the United States has the most national debt. It's not even close. It's like $38 trillion. Like, that's an incomprehensibly large number. But what if I told you that there was a time when there was no national debt? And no, it wasn't on July 5th, 1776. Actually, after the revolution, there was a lot of national debt. The only president to pay down the national debt was Andrew Jackson. And honestly, I don't know if that was good, because right after there was a massive recession. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, obviously, I am a YouTuber. If you're watching this on Instagram, yes, I have a YouTube channel, and I started this there first. But most people do watch me on YouTube, so that probably didn't make any sense. But anyways, another person who is a YouTuber and much more famous than I am is Donald Trump. And while I may only have 1,478 subscribers, which I'm grateful for every single one of you, Donald Trump is the first American president to receive a golden play button. You get a golden play button when you get 1 million subscribers. So now I am officially on the road to pass Donald Trump in subscribers. I don't think I'm gonna do it, at least not anytime soon, but I don't know, maybe.